The Galactic Assembly gathered inside a massive circular hall that floated at the center of a neutral star system, a place built so no species felt more important than another. The room glowed with soft blue lights, and the air hummed with the gentle vibration of translation engines that turned thousands of alien languages into something everyone could understand. Delegates from across the galaxy filled their seats, each representing a world, a culture, or an alliance far different from the next. Some arrived in floating pods, some walked on 6 legs, and some appeared only as holograms because their home planets were too far for physical travel. It was supposed to be a routine meeting, nothing more than updates on trade routes, security reports, and scientific cooperation. Many came relaxed and half-distracted, expecting a dull session that would end quickly so they could return to their own matters. But something felt off that day. Whispers rose as a new topic appeared on the agenda, one that had not been discussed in many years. The words, "Human Ban Review," flickered across the main display, and the moment the delegates read it, the entire hall shifted in mood. Some laughed quietly, others groaned, and a few rolled their eyes so dramatically that the gesture translated even across species. Humans had always been a controversial topic in the galaxy, known for being unpredictable, emotional, and sometimes frightening in their determination. The ban placed on them long ago was considered settled history. Most believed there was no reason to bring it up again. A tall insectoid representative tapped his claws together in amusement and whispered to his neighbor that humans must have pushed for this discussion again. A gelatinous creature rippled its surface in annoyance, complaining that humans always wanted attention. Several delegates joked that maybe humans were bored and needed something dramatic to stir up. Even before the meeting officially began, the mocking voices grew loud enough that the translation engines struggled to decide which insults to process first. It was clear that many species saw humanity as a minor group with an exaggerated sense of importance. The presiding officer of the assembly, an ancient species known for their calm neutrality, raised a hand-like limb to silence the room. The light softened, the hum of the hall deepened, and the official recording systems activated. Even then, a wave of impatience spread through the seats as the officer explained that the request to review the human ban was not from the humans themselves but from a coalition of smaller species. That alone surprised many. Why would anyone else want to reopen the debate? What benefit was there in returning to a topic buried so long ago? The confusion, however, did little to reduce the ridicule. A feathered ambassador clicked her beak and said the coalition must have been pressured or confused. A stone-skinned being rumbled that it was a waste of time. A reptilian delegate flicked his tongue in irritation, muttering that humans were too dramatic for galactic politics. Still, procedure was procedure, and the officer announced that the review session would continue. Screens shifted, documents loaded, and the assembly prepared to examine old decisions. But the atmosphere remained thick with disbelief and sarcasm. A few younger representatives leaned forward with mild curiosity, wondering if they might finally learn something interesting about the humans' past dealings with the galaxy. Most others simply expected the session to confirm what they already believed, that humans had always been troublesome, that the ban had been necessary, and that discussing it again was nothing more than a political distraction. As the conversation continued, a subtle tension rippled through the room. Some species sat stiffly, their posture betraying that they knew far more than they were willing to say. Others fidgeted, sensing the strange undercurrent but unable to understand it. Something about the human ban felt incomplete, as if a part of the story had been erased or hidden. Yet the louder voices drowned out the unease with jokes, dismissive comments, and amused guesses about how humans might try to defend themselves this time. No one expected the discussion to matter. No one imagined that the meeting would shift the galaxy's understanding of humanity. The assembly believed it was handling old paperwork, a simple formality, nothing more. Many were already planning to leave early, confident the topic would be dismissed quickly. They had no idea that a piece of truth, long buried, long forgotten, was about to enter the room and silence every mocking voice. For now, the assembly continued with its noisy chatter, completely unaware of how much their opinions were about to change. Several delegates leaned back in their seats with clear amusement, seeing the human ban topic appear on the agenda. For them, this was an opportunity not for serious discussion but for entertainment. The moment the presiding officer invited comments, a wave of sarcastic laughter moved across the hall like a ripple on water. An amphibian representative let out a croaking chuckle and said humans were probably begging for attention again, making several nearby delegates snicker loudly. A scaled creature with bright orange eyes hissed a joke about humans being too dramatic to be taken seriously, and the translator engine repeated the insult in dozens of languages, which made the laughter grow even louder. They mocked not just humanity's decisions but their entire reputation. One avian delegate fluffed her feathers in contempt while reminding the room how humans once attempted a risky evacuation mission that went wrong due to what she called human impulse. Another alien with crystalline skin bragged that his species had never caused such chaos, claiming humans always created problems where none existed. A few delegates clapped their claws or appendages together as if they were attending a comedy show instead of a serious council meeting. The noise grew so loud that the presiding officer had to raise his voice twice just to restore order. Even then, the mockery did not slow. One species known for its sharp memory listed several historical incidents involving humans, purposely exaggerating them or skipping context to make the humans look foolish. They spoke of humans fighting impossible odds, but instead of showing respect, they twisted the stories into jokes about humans being reckless and desperate for glory. A horned delegate laughed so hard that his chair vibrated. He said humans were always trying to act like heroes even when no one asked them to, and many in the room nodded as if this were a proven fact rather than a biased opinion. The atmosphere shifted from formal debate to open ridicule, with no one considering how unfair or inaccurate the comments were. Several younger representatives looked confused. They had grown up long after the human ban and did not understand why humans were so disliked. They whispered to their elders for explanations, but the answers were always the same. Humans were troublemakers, unpredictable, emotional, and impossible to control. These explanations were spoken with such confidence that the younger delegates accepted them without question. After all, when so many voices repeated the same stories, who would think to doubt them? The assembly had become a place where myths about humanity were treated as truth, and truth was something no one had bothered to verify for decades. A water-dwelling delegate floated inside her suspension pod and said humans always acted like they were the center of the galaxy. Another delegate, barely containing his amusement, replied that humans probably pushed for the review because they wanted to feel important again. They laughed at the idea that humans believed themselves misunderstood. They joked that humans should be grateful the ban existed because without it, humans would find new ways to get themselves into trouble. Every comment was met with more laughter, more nods, more dismissive gestures. No one paused to wonder whether they were judging an entire species based on incomplete or distorted knowledge. Some delegates took their mockery further, suggesting the meeting should skip the topic entirely. One reptilian representative said reviewing the human ban was a waste of time. Another claimed humans were too primitive to deserve reconsideration. A metallic-skinned ambassador even suggested adding new restrictions simply because he found the idea amusing. The room erupted again, the sound echoing through the high ceiling of the hall. The translation devices struggled to keep up, their lights flickering as hundreds of overlapping jokes filled the air. It was clear that the assembly was not merely biased but comfortable in its prejudice, as though mocking humans had become a tradition passed down from generation to generation. In the midst of the laughter, a few quiet individuals noticed something troubling. The older delegates who had lived through the earlier conflicts involving humanity never joined the mockery. They sat silently, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed on the center of the hall. They knew more than they said, but they never corrected the others. Perhaps they feared political backlash, or perhaps they carried memories too heavy to speak aloud. Either way, their silence went unnoticed, drowned out by the noise of ridicule that filled the chamber. The presiding officer finally raised his hand again, trying to restore the seriousness of the session. But even then, the room hummed with leftover laughter. Delegates leaned back, still smirking, confident that nothing humans had done could possibly change their opinions. They believed they knew everything important, and everything they knew painted humans as a reckless, chaotic species unworthy of trust. Their mockery was not just casual teasing, it was a reflection of a deep prejudice that had shaped the galaxy's view of humanity for generations. None of them realized how wrong they were. None imagined that the truth, when finally revealed, would strike them harder than any human weapon ever could. For now, they laughed, unaware that the evidence waiting to be shown would silence the entire room and force every mocking voice to confront a reality they had ignored for far too long. The great hall was still full of laughter when the doors at the far end opened with a soft mechanical hiss. Most delegates did not even bother turning to look, assuming it was just another late arrival or an assistant delivering documents. But the laughter slowly faded when a single human figure stepped inside, walking with calm, steady steps toward the center of the chamber. It was Ambassador Lyra Dovan, one of the few humans still allowed to attend assembly meetings in person. Her presence did not intimidate anyone, but it certainly caught their attention. Humans were rare here, and whenever one appeared, the room always reacted, even if the reaction was mockery or suspicion. Lyra wore a simple dark uniform, nothing flashy, nothing designed to demand authority. Yet something about her posture showed quiet confidence. She held a small, sealed data module in one hand, a device shaped like a smooth silver oval. It glowed softly, as if carrying something important, something the assembly had not expected to see that day. Some delegates narrowed their eyes as she approached, already whispering among themselves. They assumed she had brought more excuses, emotional appeals, or exaggerated stories meant to defend humanity's reputation. A tall delegate with emerald skin muttered that humans loved drama and this must be another attempt to gain sympathy. A feathered ambassador giggled, convinced Lyra would try to convince them that humans were misunderstood heroes. But Lyra did not look upset by the whispers. She did not rush or stumble. She moved with the calmness of someone who knew exactly why she was there and what she carried. When she reached the center of the hall, she stopped, bowed her head politely, and waited for permission to speak. Even her silence carried a strange strength, like a quiet storm building behind a closed door. The presiding officer, sensing a shift in the mood, tapped the control panel and granted her the floor. A soft light formed a circle around her, marking her as the official speaker. Lyra raised her eyes and looked around the hall. Hundreds of faces stared back, some amused, some annoyed, a few curious, and none expecting anything important. She could feel their judgments, their assumptions, their long-held prejudice. But she also felt something deeper beneath the noise. A heaviness. A truth buried under years of misunderstanding. She understood that many in this room believed humans were reckless fools. She understood they mocked the idea of reviewing the human ban. And she understood that no words alone could change their minds. That was why she had brought the data module. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. She explained that she carried a recorded archive, collected not just by humans but by several alien species who had once worked alongside them. She clarified that the footage was not human propaganda but official cross-species evidence, records locked away under high security, unseen for decades. The moment she said this, the room shifted. Some delegates frowned. Others leaned forward. The laughter faded completely. No one had expected her to bring something classified. No one had expected her to bring evidence at all. Still, several delegates reacted with skepticism. A reptilian representative hissed that humans always exaggerated their stories. Another suggested the footage was manipulated. One delegate even joked that the data module probably contained nothing more than a dramatic speech or a desperate plea. The mockery sparked small pockets of laughter again, but this time it felt weaker, less confident. There was something unsettling about the way Lyra stood, quiet, composed, almost too calm, as if she knew a secret none of them were ready for. Instead of arguing back, she simply lifted the data module and offered it to the presiding officer. Her gesture held no anger, no defensiveness. It was almost gentle. She said the assembly had every right to decide the truth for themselves but insisted the footage must be seen before any judgment was made. Her words were respectful but firm, leaving no room for dismissal. The hall fell silent as she finished. Even those who disliked humanity could not ignore the seriousness in her tone. Some delegates exchanged confused glances. Why would a human ambassador bring something so important, so risky, if it were just another attempt to look heroic? Why did she seem so certain? A quiet tension settled over the chamber, replacing the earlier mockery. For the first time that day, the assembly felt the weight of the moment. Something was about to be revealed, something none of them had expected, something powerful enough to cut through years of bias. Lyra stepped back, folded her hands behind her, and waited. She did not speak again. She did not try to persuade or explain further. She simply stood in silence, letting the presence of the data module speak for her. The assembly, once noisy and mocking, now found itself strangely unsettled. They had laughed at humans for so long that they had forgotten how unpredictable the truth could be. And as the presiding officer prepared to activate the footage, many felt a sudden, uneasy thought rising inside them: what if everything they believed about humans was wrong? The presiding officer held the small silver data module in his hands, studying it as if it were heavier than it looked. The room remained strangely quiet, a sharp contrast to the laughter and mocking that had filled it moments earlier. Delegates exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence slipping away. They had expected the human ambassador to argue, to defend, to plead. They had not expected her to hand over something so serious, something that looked too important to be part of any emotional performance. The officer connected the module to the central display system, and a faint hum spread through the hall as the device synchronized with the ancient machinery of the assembly. A soft blue glow appeared on the massive screen suspended above the delegates. It shimmered like a sleeping star, waiting to awaken. The officer announced that the footage inside the module was locked, protected by a multi-species encryption protocol. Several delegates lifted their heads in surprise. Multi-species encryption was used only for threats that involved more than one civilization. Why would humans bring something like that? The officer's voice continued, explaining that authorization codes were embedded within the recording itself, confirming it as a verified cross-species archive and not a human-made fabrication. This piece of information made the room even more tense. For the first time, many sensed that whatever they were about to see was not a simple story or human exaggeration but something real, something official, something that had been hidden away for reasons no one understood. Despite the uncertainty, some delegates still tried to joke. A reptilian representative muttered that the humans were probably using outdated footage to make themselves look brave. Another scoffed that humans loved dramatic reveals. But their voices sounded thin now, lacking the loud confidence they had earlier. The presiding officer ignored them and activated the final command. The blue glow deepened, the lights dimmed, and the screen sharpened into focus. Before the footage began, Lyra Dovan gave a final warning. She spoke in the same calm tone, though something in her eyes suggested she knew the weight of what the assembly was about to witness. She said the recording was not a message of pride or a plea for sympathy. Instead, it was a truth the galaxy had forgotten, truth that many had never been allowed to see. She reminded them that history had gaps and that not all of those gaps were accidents. Some were deliberate. Her words did not accuse anyone directly, but they made several delegates shift uncomfortably, as if she had struck something inside them they wished had remained hidden. The hall fell completely silent when she finished. Even the translation devices seemed to lower their hum, as though they sensed the seriousness of the moment. The officer nodded at her, then turned back to the screen and activated the footage. A cold wave of anticipation passed through the room. Mockery vanished. Laughter faded into memory. Every eye locked onto the screen, waiting to see the truth the human ambassador claimed to carry. At first, nothing appeared except darkness. Then a faint light flickered, revealing a star system burning under attack. The delegates gasped. This was not staged, not dramatized, not edited. The view came from raw surveillance feeds of several species ships, all time-stamped and authenticated. The footage jumped from one angle to another, ships exploding one after another, planets losing atmosphere, civilians running through collapsing structures. A deep, hostile silence settled over the hall as they recognized what they were watching. It was a crisis none of them had spoken about in decades. A threat so deadly that only fragments of the story had ever been recorded in public history. Many in the room had assumed those fragments were exaggerated, or misinterpreted, or too painful to revisit. The presiding officer's voice, usually strong and steady, trembled slightly as he confirmed what the assembly was seeing. The event had been classified across dozens of worlds. Only a few leaders from each species had been given access to the full archive. Most of those leaders had since died, and the truth had been buried with them. The officer explained that the human ban had been enacted shortly after this event, but he had never seen the connection. Now, with the footage preparing to play, even he was unsure what the recording would reveal. Several delegates suddenly understood why Lyra had brought the module. The ban had been debated based on incomplete or distorted information. And now, for the first time, the entire assembly would see the real context. Whether they liked humans or not no longer mattered. The truth was coming, and it was too big to ignore. As the footage prepared to shift from the destruction to the actions of those involved, a deep, uneasy silence fell over the hall. The mocking was gone. The arrogance was gone. The certainty was gone. All that remained was a collective breath held by hundreds of species, waiting to witness something that would challenge everything they believed about humans, and possibly everything they believed about themselves. The screen brightened, and the image shifted from distant destruction to ground-level chaos, showing the true horror of what had happened during the Silent War. At first, the delegates were confused. They had heard of alien attacks before, border conflicts, pirate raids, political clashes. But this was different. The threat shown in the footage was not a rival species or a known enemy. It was a swarm, a moving wall of living darkness made of countless organisms that moved like a single mind. The creatures tore through everything in their path: metal, stone, shields, even air itself seemed to shake when they approached. Delegates leaned closer, some gripping their seats tightly as they watched entire colonies fall in minutes. The perspective changed again, this time showing a human outpost caught in the middle of the storm. The humans did not flee. They did not panic. They immediately formed defensive lines, shouting orders, activating shields, pulling civilians into safe corridors. Their voices were calm, focused, completely different from the reckless image the assembly believed. One human soldier carried 2 alien children, one from a species humans had never even met before, running through falling debris without hesitation. Another human engineer manually stabilized a shield generator even though sparks flew across his body, burning through his suit. The delegates stared, stunned. They had never been shown this before. They were told humans were the cause of chaos, not the ones trying to stop it. The footage switched to orbital recordings. Alien ships attempted to fire at the swarm, but their weapons were too weak, their shields too fragile. Panic spread across their fleets, and many ships tried to jump away, leaving civilians behind on dying worlds. But then the view zoomed in on a single human battleship holding its position between the swarm and an evacuation route. Its engines glowed red from overheating, its weapons nearly melted, but it did not move. Over 30 evacuation vessels, carrying hundreds of thousands of alien refugees, passed behind it. The human ship absorbed attack after attack, its hull burning like a small sun. Even when a section ripped open and vented into space, the humans inside kept firing, refusing to abandon their post. The room in the assembly grew cold and still. Many delegates who had mocked humanity earlier now looked pale. They watched another clip, this one from medical drones recording a rescue team. Humans pushed through collapsing tunnels to reach trapped civilians. The air was filled with toxic gas. Warning lights flashed everywhere. Yet the humans moved with determination, pulling bodies out, prioritizing alien civilians over their own safety. A human medic placed her oxygen mask on a gasping alien elder, offering her own life without hesitation. Her heartbeat slowed on the monitor, but she smiled as the alien began to breathe again. In another scene, a group of human pilots executed a desperate maneuver. They flew their small fighters directly into the swarm to carve open a narrow escape corridor. Their ships exploded one by one, but each explosion pushed the enemy back just enough for a transport ship to slip through. The delegates watched these pilots die, quietly, without dramatic music, without speeches, just doing their duty because no one else could. The silence in the assembly deepened, heavy with shock. Many had believed humans acted out of pride, recklessness, or stupidity. But what they saw now was discipline, strategy, and sacrifice far beyond what any species had shown during that dark time. The most overwhelming footage appeared near the end. The swarm had reached its peak strength, surrounding the last remaining evacuation point. The combined fleets of 8 species had already retreated, believing the position was lost. But the humans stayed. They formed what the records labeled Line Zero, a final barrier between the civilians and total extinction. The footage showed humans locking themselves into exosuits, pulling damaged equipment into place, forcing malfunctioning weapons to fire manually. Their voices were calm, steady, almost peaceful. They knew they would not survive. But they also knew the civilians behind them had a chance if they held the line for just a little longer. The delegates watched the last transmission from the human commander. He did not shout or cry. He simply said, "They are almost through. Keep going. We'll hold as long as we can." Then the screen showed the humans fighting until the final moment, their suits breaking, their shields falling, their bodies failing beneath the endless swarm. And even as they fell, they continued to protect the escape route with every last breath. The recording ended on a silent battlefield, empty except for drifting ash where the humans had once stood. A heavy stillness took hold of the hall. No one spoke. No one moved. The footage had torn apart every assumption they had made, every joke they had laughed at, every unfair story they had repeated for years. The humans they mocked were not reckless fools. They were warriors, rescuers, protectors, beings who had given everything, even their lives, to save a galaxy that later judged them without knowing the truth. The screen froze on the final image of the battlefield, where nothing remained of the human defenders except drifting ashes and the quiet glow of ruined armor. The hall stayed silent for a long moment, as if the air itself had forgotten how to move. Delegates who had been laughing minutes earlier now sat completely still, their faces pale, their breaths shallow. It was as if the truth had struck them harder than any weapon ever could. That last recording, the calm voice of the human commander, the selfless actions of every soldier on that line, it all settled into their minds like a heavy stone sinking into deep water. Some delegates blinked rapidly, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Others lowered their eyes, unable to meet the gaze of the human ambassador standing quietly near the center. A few placed their hands over their chests, a gesture of mourning or respect in their cultures. No words came, no jokes, no mocking. What they had seen was not a story told by humans. It was not a rumor, not an exaggerated legend, not political propaganda. It was proof, undeniable, unfiltered proof, of how humanity had acted when the galaxy needed help most. And the truth was nothing like the tales they had repeated for years. The young delegates looked especially shaken. For them, humans had always been a warning, a lesson about what not to become. They had grown up hearing adults talk about human recklessness and human chaos. Yet everything they had seen showed discipline, bravery, compassion, and sacrifice. It was confusing for them, even painful, to realize how much of their education had been built on incomplete or twisted information. One young ambassador whispered to her mentor, asking why they had never been told this. The mentor gave no answer, only stared at the screen with a troubled expression. But the strongest reaction came from the older delegates, the ones who had survived the silent war. They had always been quiet whenever humans were mocked, and now everyone understood why. They had known something. Maybe not all of it, but enough to feel the weight of the past pressing on their shoulders. Some of them looked away from the footage, memories flickering in their eyes, memories of being rescued, protected, or saved by humans during those chaotic days. Memories they had buried because speaking about them had once been considered dangerous or politically inconvenient. Suddenly, one crystalline-skinned ambassador stood up. His voice, usually proud and unshakable, now trembled. He admitted that his homeworld had been among those rescued by human ships. He confessed that the official records had been rewritten later, crediting another species for the evacuation. He said he had never questioned it because the truth was classified, and speaking out could have risked his position. His confession fell over the room like a cold wind, and several delegates realized they too had heard fragments of the truth long ago, fragments they had dismissed or forgotten under the weight of politics and propaganda. The presiding officer looked shaken as well. He glanced at Lyra Dovan, studying her calm expression. For the first time since the meeting began, he understood why she had spoken with such quiet confidence. She had never come to defend humanity with words. She had come to show the truth. And now the truth was staring every delegate in the face, too powerful to deny, too heavy to ignore. He admitted publicly that he had never seen the full archive and that he felt responsible for allowing decades of decisions to be made without the complete picture. His voice broke slightly as he spoke, and the room felt the weight of his honesty. Whispers spread across the chamber, but these whispers were not mocking. They were filled with confusion, regret, shame, and disbelief. Delegates who had insulted humanity earlier now felt their words echoing back at them like bitter poison. They realized they had mocked the ones who had died protecting their worlds. They had laughed at the species that had stood at the final line of defense while others fled. They had judged blindly, comfortably, without questioning the gaps in their own history. Some delegates covered their faces, overwhelmed by guilt. Others stared at the human ambassador with new eyes filled not with suspicion but with gratitude and sorrow. A few even felt fear, but not fear of humans. Fear of how easily the truth had been erased, how easily entire societies had been shaped by half-truths and selective records. Fear of realizing how much of their worldview might be built on similar foundations. Through it all, Lyra Dovan remained silent. She did not gloat. She did not smirk. She did not offer comfort. She simply watched the reactions unfold, knowing this moment was necessary. Humanity had never wanted praise or reward. They had only wanted fairness, understanding, and for the truth to be seen. And now, finally, the truth was out in the open. The assembly had no choice but to confront the reality they had ignored for decades. The silence in the hall was no longer empty. It was filled with grief, with respect, with the heavy understanding that everything was about to change. Several long moments passed before anyone dared to speak. The silence in the hall felt alive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Delegates who had been loud and confident earlier now seemed smaller, their pride shaken, their certainty broken. When the footage ended, it did not just change their opinions. It changed the entire atmosphere of the assembly. Shame, disbelief, regret, and confusion mixed together like a heavy fog settling over every seat. Finally, one of the delegates who had mocked humanity the most, a reptilian representative with bright golden eyes, rose to his feet. His scales once glowed proudly, but now they looked dull. He cleared his throat, and his voice cracked in a way that made many look up. He began to apologize, not with the smooth confidence of a politician, but with raw honesty. He admitted that he had mocked humans without knowing the truth, that he had repeated stories passed down to him without checking them, and that he had judged an entire species based on half-formed memories and twisted reports. His words echoed across the chamber, and several delegates lowered their eyes, realizing they had done the same. Another delegate, the feathered ambassador who had made jokes earlier, stood as well. Her feathers drooped, a sign of deep embarrassment in her species. She confessed that she had been part of a group that voted against even allowing humans to speak in earlier years. She apologized for every laugh, every dismissive gesture, every cruel comment she had made. She said that watching the footage made her realize how unjust and blind she had been. Her voice trembled with guilt, and she kept her gaze fixed on the floor, unable to meet the human ambassador's eyes. Whispers began spreading through the room. These were not whispers of mockery but of honesty. Delegates who had stayed silent for decades now found the courage to speak. A stone-skinned ambassador admitted that his people had been saved by a human engineering team, but their government had hidden the truth to avoid political embarrassment. A soft-bodied aquatic delegate confessed that she had lost family in the silent war and had been taught to blame humans for failing to prevent the disaster, not knowing that humans had been the ones who held the final line so others could escape. Her voice broke as she spoke, revealing a lifetime of bitterness built on lies. Another delegate, from a species known for strict logic, leaned forward and asked a difficult question: who had hidden the truth? Who had decided that humans should be blamed while their sacrifice remained secret? Who had shaped the narrative that humanity was reckless, dangerous, and untrustworthy? The question hung in the air like a blade. Some delegates looked toward their own governments. Others looked toward the presiding officer. A few simply stared ahead, as if afraid to even think of the answer. The truth was too big, too tangled, too painful. It was easier to mock humans than to untangle decades of political deception. Even the presiding officer felt the weight of responsibility. He admitted that the assembly had relied on incomplete reports for far too long. He accepted that the human ban had been decided during a time of fear and grief, when people were desperate for someone to blame. Humans had been the easiest target because they were different, unpredictable, and brave enough to take risks others avoided. The officer's voice softened as he confessed that the assembly had failed in its duty to seek truth before judgment. His admission struck the hall with the force of a sudden storm. Delegates realized that their leaders, not humans, had been the ones who shaped their opinions. As more delegates spoke, the atmosphere transformed from shame to determination. The truth had hurt them deeply, but it also sparked something stronger, a desire to fix what had been broken. Delegates from various species began discussing openly that the human ban had been built on foundations of fear and incomplete data. They questioned whether the ban should have existed at all. They spoke about the courage they had seen in the footage, courage that no propaganda could erase. They acknowledged that humanity had earned respect long before the ban was ever created. Some delegates even stepped forward to thank humans. A crystalline-skinned representative with tail-like fractures along his face bowed deeply toward Lyra Dovan. He said that without humans, his world would not exist today. Another delegate pressed a hand to her chest and thanked Lyra for bringing the truth, even though it must have been painful for her to watch the footage again. These expressions of gratitude were simple, but they carried enormous meaning. Each one chipped away at the prejudice that had built up for generations. The chamber slowly shifted from sorrow to responsibility. Delegates began discussing what must happen next. Many argued that the galaxy owed humanity a formal apology. Others insisted that they needed to investigate how the truth had been buried. Some suggested creating monuments, rewriting history books, or holding ceremonies to honor the fallen human soldiers. The most important question, however, was voiced softly by a quiet, elderly delegate: how could the galaxy ever repay a debt to a species that had already given everything? No one had the answer yet, but everyone knew one thing: the room would never look at humans the same way again. The hall remained filled with heavy silence as the delegates absorbed everything they had just witnessed. The guilt of their past judgments pressed on them like a physical weight. No one dared return to the arrogance or laughter that had filled the chamber earlier. Instead, the atmosphere felt sobered, thoughtful, fragile, as if the entire assembly stood at the edge of a future they had never imagined before. The presiding officer slowly rose from his seat, his expression grave but determined. He knew that the next step would define the galaxy's relationship with humanity for generations to come. He took a deep breath and announced that the assembly would now open the floor for a final motion, whether to uphold or revoke the human ban. The word spread through the hall like a spark in dry air. Delegates straightened in their seats, their hearts pounding with the weight of responsibility. The human ban had existed for decades, shaping galactic policy and opinions. Removing it would not only clear humanity's name but also force the galaxy to confront who had truly been responsible for hiding the truth. It would mean rewriting history, admitting mistakes, and taking responsibility. But after seeing the footage, very few delegates doubted what needed to be done. The ban was built on lies, misunderstandings, and fear. Humanity had not been the problem. Humanity had been the shield that protected them all. One by one, delegates activated their speaking panels. The first to speak was a tall insectoid representative who had mocked humans earlier. His voice trembled as he admitted his error. He said he now understood that bravery was not recklessness, that sacrifice was not chaos. He supported revoking the ban. Next, the feathered ambassador who had laughed the loudest earlier also expressed her regret. She said she felt ashamed of how easily she had accepted false stories. She supported revoking the ban as well. A stone-skinned delegate stood and declared that humanity had earned honor, not exclusion. Even species who had never interacted with humans before raised their voices, saying that no galaxy should punish those who had saved it. Not a single delegate stood to defend the ban. The shift was complete. Where once there had been prejudice and mockery, now there was unity and clarity. The presiding officer called for the final vote. A glowing display appeared above the hall, showing each species symbol. One by one, the symbols lit up green as delegates cast their votes. No one hesitated. No one looked away. No one doubted. The green light spread across the display like a wave of hope sweeping through the galaxy. And then, at last, the final light blinked green. The human ban was officially lifted. A soft gasp passed through the hall, not dramatic, not intense, but filled with relief, wonder, and a sense of justice finally fulfilled. Delegates turned toward the human ambassador, many with expressions of humility, others with gratitude or sorrow. Lyra Dovan stood silently, her hands folded, her face calm but touched by emotion. She had expected resistance, arguments, maybe even denial. But she had not expected overwhelming unity. She bowed her head slightly, acknowledging the vote without pride or triumph. It was never about winning. It was about truth finally being seen. Several delegates approached her, stepping down from their platforms, asking to speak with her personally. They thanked her for bringing the footage. They promised to correct the history books. They pledged to tell the next generations the truth, not the twisted stories that had fueled discrimination. Some offered condolences for the humans who had fallen in the silent war. Others asked how they could honor the sacrifices made so long ago. Lyra answered each with quiet dignity, understanding that these gestures, though late, mattered deeply. The presiding officer then suggested creating a new memorial, a galactic monument dedicated to the soldiers of Line Zero, the humans who had held back the swarm until the last possible moment. The hall responded with murmurs of agreement. Several ambassadors volunteered resources. Others offered historical archives or artistic contributions. The memorial would not erase the years of prejudice, but it would ensure that silence and lies would never bury the truth again. As the session came to a close, Lyra prepared to leave the central floor. She walked with the same calm steps she had arrived with, but this time, the atmosphere around her was different. Where earlier there had been mockery, now there was respect. Where there had been laughter, now there was gratitude. Delegates stood as she passed, not out of fear or formality, but out of genuine honor. Even species known for arrogance bowed their heads as she walked by. She represented not just humanity, but every human who had given their life for the galaxy. Before she exited the hall, Lyra paused and looked back. The assembly, once filled with prejudice and ignorance, now stood united in understanding. The ban was gone. The truth was known. The galaxy was changed forever. She left without saying a word, because none were needed. The silence that followed her was no longer mocking. It was a silence of respect, of awakening, of promises made quietly and deeply. A silence that finally understood what humans had done, and what the galaxy owed them.